Good morning. Very good to see you all. I'm not competing as much with the weather today, I can see, so that's good for me. Hopefully it's going to clear up for you all a little bit later. All right. So the topic for today is the Vikings. It's about time we speak a little bit about the Vikings, seeing as you're sailing up and down the Norwegian coast. And specifically, we're going to talk about the Viking Voyages. So Leif Erikson, you might recognize that name. And also, I'm going to do a bit more of a personal twist, talk about a little bit of family history, actually, which is one of the reasons why I put up this camera again. Again, it's just filming me, because I want to show this to my grandmother. And that will all become apparent in a little bit. So, I was born in 1993. I look around the room now. I don't think it's too presumptuous to say most people remember 1990 or 92, yeah? Is that correct? You remember 1992. There was a particular anniversary in 1992. What was that? Well, if we go back 500 years to 1492, then that was the year when Columbus sailed. He sailed across the Atlantic, right, and made what was for Europeans at the time quite the discovery that you had this whole other world on the other side of the ocean. But if we were to go back, funnily enough, almost exactly 500 years before Columbus again, so right to the let's say 992, then you had the guy Leif Erikson and his crew who sailed over the North Atlantic and were what we think, probably accurate to say, the very first Europeans to make it to America. And we have some Americans here today, perhaps, do we? US? And all of you also have Scandinavian ancestry, some of you? Yeah, some hands up here, right? We get a lot of people from Minnesota doing a pilgrimage back home. So right, you had the 1,000-year anniversary of Leif Erikson, the Viking discovery of the Americas in 1992. So I'd like to introduce you to two modern-day Vikings, modern-day British Vikings, as it were. This is David and Judy Lomax. They are my grandparents, my mother's side of the family, and they have been lifelong eager sailors in the north in particular. And in 1990, they just got a boat. This boat here, she's called Cloudwalker. Been all around the world, especially up in the north. But they were in the U.S. and they'd gotten Cloudwalker, and they were going to sail back across the North Atlantic to Norway. And as they were leaving, they heard there was so much talk, so much buzz about the 500-year Columbus Day celebrations. And everyone was getting ready for this and talking about it. And then when they'd gotten back to Norway, they'd had a stormy crossing, as it often is. They'd, opened a bottle of wine and were celebrating, sitting there with my uncle, and they were talking about, hello, find a spot. You too, sir. Please sit down, make yourself comfortable.
After a lady, yeah.
Yeah, I like he brought snacks. That's good. Everyone can bring snacks to a talk. So they were in Norway, and they were talking about how everyone was talking about the Columbus Day celebrations, but they thought, but isn't it funny that actually 500 years before that, you would also have the 1,000-year Leif Erikson celebration going on. And they were sitting on the sailboat in Bergen, I believe, and they thought, wouldn't it be cool then to celebrate the 1,000-year anniversary if we sailed back again to the US, so following in the exact same wake that Leif Erikson had done 1,000 years before. At which point my uncle, who'd had a couple of glasses perhaps, he said, well, if you're going to do that, you might as well do it on a Viking ship, he said. And David and Judy thought that was a tremendous idea. So I think they popped another bottle of wine and they started brainstorming. But there was only one problem, that they didn't have a Viking ship and they didn't know how to build one. But I guess more crazier plans have been made late in the evening. But then, spoiler alert, this turned into a proper expedition. And Judy called it, slightly tongue-in-cheek, the Bugger Columbus Expedition, to show that that the Vikings were indeed there first. And she wrote a book about the experience. It's called The Viking Voyage with Gaia to Vinland. I'm very sorry that I don't have a big stack here that I can sell to you later on. It might still be in print if you go looking on Amazon. I often get a question about that. And I only recently got to read this book. This has been part of family lore my entire life. But last year I did read it finally. And David, he used to be a BBC journalist, so he actually made a movie of this entire voyage. So they gathered together a crew. Here they are. This picture has been since been used for a Norwegian sweater commercial, where it just says "genuine Norwegian knitwear" underneath. So here we have David up in the top, and Judy, the only woman aboard the ship, right here. So we're going to talk a bit more about this trip in a bit. But they then started here in Trondheim, where you've all been, sailed down to Bergen, to Shetland, Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, and then over to the Americas, just like Leif Erikson had done it. So, before we get back to this story, we need to talk about what it was they were trying to emulate, right? Well, what caused them to do this? So we go back 1,000 years to the so-called Viking Age. And I'm going to talk about the Viking Voyages. So the people who lived, well, here we have it, our trusty Norwegian map. And Norwegians have always lived along the coast, mainly, you know, doing a lot of fishing. And most people who lived in Norway during the time we call the Viking Age wouldn't have known that themselves. They wouldn't have referred to themselves as Vikings necessarily. But they would have known the word. It was more like a verb. It's something you do. You go Vikinging, perhaps. And that means something like getting a bunch of mates together, and then you build a boat, and then you set off west to see what you can find, to explore the western frontier. I mean, that's a well-known theme, let's say, in American history, right? Go west, young man, to seek your fortune. The only issue here in Norway is when you go west, it's just the open ocean. And many people did go west seeking their fortune. Most never returned, probably found a watery grave somewhere, because it was dangerous business. But then at some point, they started finding somewhere west, the European continent, or first the British Isles, and then this led to like a mania of people going Vikinging, you could say. And we say that age begins in 793 with the sack of the monastery at Lindisfarne. This is in northern England, because that was the first registered Viking raid, and from then on there were just more and more, instead of spreading across all of Europe. And you can imagine this was, well, they were described as these heathen demons that were coming in from the north. And they're quite scary, and it's a history written by the people who were visited by the Vikings. Visited is a nice word, perhaps. Quite often who were killed and terrorized by the Vikings. But many of them also settled down in the places where they went. It's a whole big mix of people and idea of cultures during this time. And it comes to its peak in 1066. You had, well, the last attempt for the Scandinavians to take over the British Isles completely, and then you had the last Viking king, Harald, who dies, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and that sort of marks the retreat of the Viking Age as well. But in this time, how could they get there? And historians don't quite agree, but first of all, you need to look at boat technology. So this is the time, year 800s, where all around Europe, no one really dared to sail across open seas, because you didn't have ships that could withstand the biggest storms necessarily, and you wouldn't be able to navigate properly. So you always had to stay within view of land, and that's what most of the Norwegians did as well, sailing up and down the coast. But all of a sudden, the Vikings could quite reliably cross the North Sea. So first of all, you had very, very sturdy ships built in a clinker style, these Viking longships. That means you have long planks of wood that are sort of layered on top of each other. and then they would be attached with iron fastings, and then you would use maybe hemp or burnt cow hair to seal all the planks. And then this would be a very bendy build, so it would move with the ocean as well. So it was very, very sturdy through the sea. It would sort of bend with the ocean. Made out of oak mainly, with one big solid oak plank that went down the middle. And to steer it, you would use a board that would go out on the right side of the ship, called a steering board. A steering board on the right-hand side of the ship. What do you call the right-hand side of a ship? Starboard, from the Viking steering board that you would have down there pulling. And they would use sails and also rowing crews. And some crews would be up to 100 people, so you had a lot of power to keep rowing as well when you didn't have wind. So you had ships that could make it across these oceans. Not only that, but they had a very shallow bottom of the ship, shallow berth, which meant that they could very easily sail into rivers that otherwise weren't that accessible to boats, which is how they were able to sail through the entire, European continent and through Russia, and have these surprise attacks on villages that weren't used to any ships being able to get there that quickly. So they had that sort of technological edge. But then navigation-wise, we're not quite sure how they did it. They would usually, or what we think they would use, is what we call traditional methods. So that means that through the ages you've learned from your father, who was a sailor, that at this time of year the wind usually blows this way, so therefore you can just follow the wind that way, or the birds usually fly in that direction at this time of year, so just follow the birds. So you have sort of these ways of navigating. Otherwise, they'd probably use the stars and the sun. We have sort of primitive sun compasses at the time. But the issue with that is if you were stuck out at sea and you have a lot of clouds, which quite often happens, or fog, then you cannot navigate with the sun or the stars. And this was quite a normal thing that they were terrified of, because that means you'd be stranded at sea. And they had a special word for that, which pops up a lot in the sagas, which is havila. Havila means stranded at sea. And have you seen this other coastal cruising company? What are they called? They are called Havila, this other company. What a bunch of suckers, huh? Stranded at sea is what it means. Oh, but a good name, Havila. So they were very scared of that. So we think that one way they dealt with cloud cover and not being able to see the sun was by using something that's called a sunstone. Now, if any of you have seen the series Vikings, perhaps, then in that one you see the season 1, Ragnar Lothbrok. He's the first one who crosses over to Europe, and the way he does it is that he has a crystal, which means that when they're stuck, when they're hafvila, then you can use this crystal and you look through it and you can locate the sun through the clouds. And this actually works, and they found these crystals on Viking ships, remnants of Viking ships we've found, so we think that might have been a way that they were able to navigate. But be that as it may, they made it over, and it spread to a craze of people going Viking, and that might also have been due to demographic pressures, perhaps. Let's say in Norway you had loads of second sons who didn't have much going for them back home. And we all know that if you have a lot of young men with nothing to do, that's a recipe for disaster. So maybe they decided that they could go Vikinging, seek their fortune. So it's color-coded here for a bit of a timeline as to where they went. So you can see, first of all, it would be up here to Shetland and the Orkneys, northern England, Scotland, and then moving further and further south. We know they made it all the way to the Byzantine Empire and to Jerusalem, and also then through Russia, through these river systems. But we're going to follow this way here. So we see Iceland here. Iceland was populated mainly around year 800. So some sailors, as they were blown off course from Norway before that, might have spotted Iceland or settled down there. But from the year 800, then we knew about Iceland. It was a place people went to voluntarily. It was also a place you were banished to. So if you got in trouble with the Norwegian king, then he would banish you to Iceland. A bit like the Norwegian version of Australia, perhaps, right? Just send them out there. And then we see this line as our timeline goes on, moving further and further west, and this arrow to Vinland. And that's where we want to follow along. So, then we need to go to the... you have a chair there?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Then we need to go to the Viking sagas. That's where we get the history of the Viking Age. Sagas. And that's written by... church people on Iceland around the year 1200. So they're writing the history of their ancestors. And one of the most important guys is called Erik Raude. So he has a saga written about himself, Erik's Raude's saga. He also shows up in the Greenland saga, and that's for a good reason. So Erik, he got in trouble with the Norwegian king, and then he was banished to Iceland. And then, as the story goes, he was sitting there in Iceland. There's not a lot of wood on Iceland, so a good business plan back then would be to sail from Norway with timber to Iceland. You could become very rich that way. It was a dangerous trip though, because you might miss Iceland. So Erik, when he was sitting in Iceland, he was in a pub. He was drinking some mead, perhaps, and then all of a sudden, a guy comes storming in, and he says, "You've no idea what just happened to me." And he said that he was sailing from Norway with a timber shipment, and he was hafvila. He was blown off course. And then he thought he was done for, but then all the way in the west he could see some new land. But then he didn't make landfall. He went back and he was able to navigate to Iceland. He got ashore and then he ran into the pub and he met Erik and told him what had happened. And at that point, Erik, he thought, this is my chance. I'm going to go Viking. So he gathered a crew together, and actually quite a few ships. He built a bit of a fleet, and they set off west to see what they could find, pushing the frontier. And what they did find was Greenland. And that was the first time anyone from Europe had landed on Greenland. So Erik Raude, very famous in the sagas for being the guy who basically colonized Greenland for the Vikings. So he's very famous in the sagas. But then he started a family. End of the story. Happily ever after. And you might know something about Scandinavian names. What would his son be called?
Erikson.
Erikson, right? Son of Erik. So now finally we get to Leif, son of Erik, Leif Erikson. And again, this series, Vikings, he pops up there. We don't know if he was this handsome. They don't mention in the sagas, but we think maybe this is what he looked like. So Leif Erikson, visionary explorer or lucky sailor. What does that mean? Well, he was born on Greenland, and then he decided to go back to Norway to seek his fortune, and he moved to a place called Nidaros, where you've been, Trondheim today, an old Viking city, and he worked for the founder of Nidaros called Olav Tryggvason, the old Viking king. And then Olav Tryggvason, he said, Leif, you have your dad over in Greenland. He's ruling over all these heathens. Because at this point, many of the Vikings were Christian. Olav Tryggvason was a big Christian king. So he said, Leif, I have a mission for you. You need to go back to your father's country in Greenland and Christianize the whole place. So Leif thought, all right, finally I have a mission. And then in the lucky sailor version, what Leif did was that he then set off. He sailed past Iceland, and on his way to Greenland, he was blown off course, and he was lost at sea. And then he suddenly found some more land to the west, and he made landfall, and that was the discovery of the Americas. But so that's one saga, tells the lucky sailor story. In another saga, they view him as, like his father before him, a visionary explorer. So they say that he made it to Greenland, he started his mission, and then one evening, when he was sitting in the pub with a pint of mead, all of a sudden someone bursts in. Boom! You have no idea what just happened to me. And he'd been sailing to Greenland, but he was blown off, and he was hafvila, lost at sea, and then he saw land to the west, and he didn't make landfall, came back and told Leif what he had seen, and then Leif, just like his dad, gathered a group of people together and went Vikinging further west. So what is it he then saw? That is what is reported in the sagas, and we'll have a look at. So they made it then from Greenland, traveling west, and he says that the first thing they saw was a land he called Helluland. And Helle in Norwegian means, and also in Old Norwegian, means like a slab of rock. So, makes sense geographically, but also due to the description that this would be Baffin Island, which is a very rocky, bare place. So that would be the land of slabs of rock, Hellula. And then, as they make their way further south, they get to what they called Markland. And Marka, anyone who speaks Norwegian, you know that means like out in the woods and beautiful nature with a lot of greenery. Marka, so Mark country. So we think that's probably the Labrador coast in Newfoundland, where you have a lot more vegetation. But they didn't settle down there. They settled down even further south in a place that they called Vinland. And you know what vin means? Wine, indeed. So wine country, and that's what people were thinking about, and they reported that they did find grapes, etc. So based on the sagas, these stories, which were the only sources that we had, people were looking for Viking settlements here in Canada and even further down into the US, but always moving further south, looking for the wine country, basically. And all the way up to the 1960, we hadn't found any proof that the Vikings actually were there. This was just viewed as a theory. You were probably a bit of an eccentric sort of saga nerd if you were into this kind of stuff. Until the two biggest saga nerds of them all came around. That was Helge and Anne Ingstad. And they had a theory. Well, Helge Ingstad, he's a very famous Norwegian explorer. He was the governor of Svalbard at one point. He'd spent loads of time traveling, crossing Greenland, doing all the explorer stuff. And his wife was a very accomplished archaeologist. So they had a theory that this word vin in the ancient Norse didn't actually refer to wine, but rather to a meadow. So they had this sort of linguistic theory that then led them to look a slightly different place. And then Anne, she led the archaeological excavation, and they started looking in a place called Lansom Meadows, right here at the tip of this island in Newfoundland. And there they finally found the remnants of Leif Erikson's camp. So this is the first time, 1960, when we say that we had proof that the Vikings actually were there. And then there was a big celebration, and all the Norwegians said, yes, we were there first. We made it. And I think there's still quite a lot of we were there firstism, especially among the Scandinavian Americans, perhaps, in the US. And this picture here, so this all used to just be covered in meadows. And I spoke to a guest, actually, who grew up on Newfoundland, and he said that his grandfather came from Lansom Meadows, and had told him stories that when he was a kid, he used to play on these big mounds. And him and his friends, they thought they were old Native American burial grounds or something. I don't think you're supposed to play on those, neither. But then they discovered in the 60s that they'd been playing on these Viking remnants all the time. So then we had proof that they indeed had sailed this trip that the Gaia Voyage did. They also stopped there in Lansom Meadows. And after all of this Leif Erikson, this led to a Leif Erikson craze. And all of that, we were there firstism. So you can find statues of Leif Erikson all around the world. Maybe some of you recognize some of these. We have here, this is a Boston Leif Erikson. Looks like a Greek figure for some reason. I don't really know what they were thinking about there. What's the next one? Here you have Chicago Leif Erikson, more Viking style. And then you have the biggest one over there. That's in Leif Erikson Park in Duluth. Anyone been there?
Yeah.
Aha, yes, you've probably seen this statue. Here, this one's in Seattle. They just put him in a parking lot, it seems like. Why not? And this one, do you recognize this Leif Erikson?
Yes.
Yes! If you went for a walk in Trondheim the other day, Nidaros, then you would have seen this. This is right by where our ship was.
Yeah.
And of course, the people of Trondheim, they claim Leif Erikson because he was from there. I think the people in Iceland, they claim him as well. Of course, people in Greenland want him, and then people from Newfoundland probably claim him as well. Everyone wants a piece of Leif Erikson. Everyone wants a piece of Leif Erikson, including 1,000 years later, David and Judy Lomax, the modern Viking. So, just back to this story again. So you know it happened, but now I'll tell you a little bit of the backstory here. So I call it an unlikely journey for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because they just crossed the Atlantic one way, and Judy, who wrote this book, she can be quite stormy in the North Atlantic, so she swore she would never sail ever again. But she also compares sailing to childbirth. Maybe some of you can relate to that, but apparently it's something that when you're in it, you think, what on earth am I doing here? Never again. But then a couple of months after, when you've been telling the story, you know, then you think, it's actually pretty good. Maybe it's time for another cruise. So she thought that maybe it's time for another baby. Let's go for it. So she was also on board for this. And unlikely journey, because after they'd woken up with a bit of a hangover, having started making this plan, they realized we have no idea how to get hold of a Viking ship or what we're doing. So then started a little bit of a project of making phone calls. They had this was in 1990. They had to get it done by 91 because they had to beat the Columbus Day celebrations. That was the whole point, right? The bugger Columbus part of this. That for this to work as a stunt, it needed to beat the 500-year anniversary. So they were on a tight time budget. They had about a year to pull this off. And they quickly realized when they were asking around that if you want to do anything that has to do with Vikings, then you need to speak to one guy, and his name is Ragnar Thorseth. Here he is. Their legend says that he still has the exact same facial expression. Well, in every single picture. So Ragnar, he was a bit of he's still alive. He lives west coast of Norway, quite close to where Svenja lives. And he is and was a bit of a legend. So he'd done loads of stuff. He'd built his own rowing boat and rowed solo from Bergen to Shetland. As you do, I guess he wanted a pint or something. And then he'd crossed Greenland on skis, I think. He'd done loads of stuff, but then in the 80s, so his entire life he'd been obsessed with Vikings. So in the 80s, he had his own 2 replica Viking ships built. One of them called Saga Siglar, right here. So a copy of the Oseberg ship, which is sort of the oldest Viking ship that we have today that is still in good condition. And then he set off around the world for about 3 years, sailing these Viking ships, and got a lot of media attention. So he was like famous as the Viking guy, and probably was the guy in the world who knew the most about how to sail Viking ships. So David and Judy visited him. He said, okay, come on in, gave them a cup of coffee, and then they tried to get him aboard. But he basically said, no thank you, I do not want anything to do with your expedition, you crazy British amateurs. And no, you cannot use my boat. So basically he wished them good luck, but he was out. Now, spoiler, he's going to return at some point, as you can see on this picture. So then David and Judy don't know what they're doing, but then they get in touch with a shipbuilding place in southern Norway. And they say, this is very exciting. We build old original ships using the old original techniques. We would like to build your Viking ship, and we can do it in the time you request at a very reasonable price. So now they kind of have, all right, the ship. We have a possibility of getting a ship here. But then they need funding, and they've been calling to the Norwegian state. They weren't quite interested in supporting anything. They were speaking to NRK, which is like the Norwegian version of the BBC, to get a film done to finance it. They were also speaking to the BBC, but none of this was really sort of working until this becomes even more of a family story when my grandfather, on the Norwegian side of the family, he got involved because he had just retired and he kind of felt like he needed a project, something to do, and he had a lot of contacts in the business world. So he set up a meeting with a guy called Knut Utstein Kloster, who was like an eccentric millionaire philanthropist kind of guy, who at the time owned one of the biggest cruise ship companies in the world, where his vision of the future was one with no borders and everyone just living together on cruise ships, I guess, floating around the world. And that sounds cool for some of you, like a nightmare for someone else. But he thought that this is great. This is like he could support the Viking spirit of discovery, he called it, right? And wanted to finance this. So they have a meeting with him, and he says, I'll finance the whole thing. So now they have the money, they have the ship going, and everything's going really well. And then they get a telephone from a guy, let's call him Petter, from the Norwegian Foreign Office, saying, very well done, chaps. That's how they speak in the Norwegian Foreign Office. Very well done, chaps. We'll take over from here. And then David and Judy were pushed out, and this turned into an official Norwegian Icelandic collaboration, because they thought it's actually a really good idea. This is some good PR that they can do. So it turned into an all official thing, and now you have all these official receptions you're going to have along the way when they get to the U.S. They're planning this whole big festival. President's going to be there. It's huge. And that could have been the end of the story for David and Judy, but we'll skip a little bit ahead to the point where they say, okay, you can come aboard as part of the crew. So they were allowed to be the only non-Scandinavian members of the crew. And then they said that, David, you are allowed to bring 2 camera guys to make a film of it. So they were back on board, but now sort of just parts of the crew. And then they had to name the expedition, and some people wanted to call it the Leif Erikson, or the Norway. The Icelandic people didn't like that, you can imagine. But then the president of, Prime Minister of Iceland, Vigdis Finnbogadottir, yeah, that's a good name, yeah. Dottir means that's daughter of name. Daughter of Finnbogadottir. And she came with the name that stuck, which was Gaia. And Gaia that's the Greek goddess of the earth, basically, of nature. Because the trip was supposed to have now not only the Viking celebration, but also this focus on humanity's need to live in harmony with nature, kind of thing. And the sort of mission statement, as this eccentric millionaire stated it, was: the Vikings were skilled and energetic adventurers. They were close to nature and relied on instincts and techniques their modern counterparts have long forgotten. Their spirit of adventure is the sort of quality which is needed now. It is the spirit modern man needs in the search for a peaceful common future and a course to save humanity, the world, from environmental catastrophe and the consequences of famine, war, and global recession. Yes, indeed. And they were 100% successful with everything. End of story. Yeah, so that was sort of the idea. You can also say this is like the most charitable interpretation of the Viking spirit, perhaps. You might as well focus on their good stuff. They weren't going to do any pillaging along the way. So they set out, and this focus on the sort of environmental side quite often got put on the back row, you can say. Most people they visited were just really stoked that there was someone celebrating this Scandinavian past of the places that they were, and they were interested in how does a Viking ship work and everything. But still, they were supposed to make observations about whale population, etc. And Judy, she documents in her book how it was quite shocking actually to see, for someone who grown up in England, just to see some of the old traditional practices that you have on these islands further up in the north. So for example, pictures from the Faroes here, you can see the whale hunt, where they basically just herd the whales up on a beach, and then everyone goes out with spears, just slaughtering them. And it's a literal bloodbath going on. So they were met with that sort of obviously feeling that this was wrong, and at the time there were many new treatises that were popping up banning things like whaling and sealing, etc. in these regions. But then also meeting the locals who would argue that no, this is part of our traditional way of life, and it actually gives us a closer connection to nature. And also, if you think about it, this isn't actually a threat to the greater population. Whether that's true or not, I'm not quite sure, but they would say things like, factory farming is the issue, not, one whale is the same as 1,000 chickens. What's worse, right? One life or 1,000 lives. You have all of these sort of philosophical questions that also pop up there. So that's also a bit of a streak going through the book, especially because you get up to Greenland, for example, where then you have people who lots of alcoholism actually at that time in Greenland, because people who used to live off sealing and now that was banned, and who felt like sort of, okay, what are we going to do now? And then the worst part of, like, you could say an addiction to just a regular sort of welfare check coming, were able to be seen there. So they sort of deal with these issues as well. But the main part of the book is about the excitement and the project of such a trip. And some things are like mundane issues, like Judy talking about what it's like. Well, first of all, they were two British people on the ship, and the Norwegian crew didn't always like that, just because then they had to speak English, and they didn't speak very good English. So that created a bit of tension. Also, the fact that Judy was a woman aboard a ship, that was not necessarily very popular. Especially that she quotes one guy who they didn't have a good relationship in the beginning. His name was Gunnar. He was the youngest guy of the crew. And Gunnar, he says, if we were going to have a woman on board, why did it have to be an old one? He not very happy. Not very happy with that. I mean, in Judy's defense, she wasn't very old at this point. But they do reconcile at a certain point as well when they come in closer to the end of their journey. Yeah, like I said, Ragnar Thorseth was back in the action at this point. He was the captain. Now that this had become a full, respectable venture, Ragnar Thorseth was there, and they were then sailing in to the U.S. for the final celebration in New York, and then they were caught out in some bad weather. And this you don't see in the documentary that was made. And they also actually had a boat following them to take care of them. So you had some extra creature comforts, you could say, but they at this point thought that the boat was going to capsize and they were going to be done for because they were caught in some pretty bad weather. But they did make it in. But it just shows how tricky would have been to try doing any journey like that back in the day when you didn't have all this equipment. And especially because they made it fine, they got into the US, but then Ragnar Thorseth, to capitalize on some of this PR that was built up at this point, he took his two other boats and went on a bit of a tour afterwards. And then a few months after this, outside the coast of Spain, they were caught in a storm and both of the boats capsized and they sank. Both of the crews survived, everyone survived. They were later able to salvage the boats. But it goes to show that even then, with all of the cutting-edge, safety equipment they would have had on board, and weather forecasting and stuff, then this is what can happen. So a dangerous profession to be Vikinging back in the day. So yeah, they made it in, and this has turned into family legend for me. It was right before I was born, but it's not. Yeah, and it was like a big stunt. And people loved it in the U.S. As well. But it's not. They weren't the first people to do this. It wasn't necessarily an original idea. The first guy to do this, the original Viking in-your-face Columbus stunt, that actually happened in 1893. So again, this year where they were celebrating a 100-year anniversary of Columbus. Then you had this guy here, Magnus Andersson, who built a ship. He called it Viking, and then he sailed all the way to Chicago to crash the World Fair in Chicago for the Columbus celebrations, and then he said, "We were here first." And remember, that was the time before we had any hard proof. So for him to do this, this was sort of quite a big deal at the time, to prove that this kind of ship could actually have made it. Since you also have, this ship was called Homecoming and was built in early 2000s, I think, by you probably know it, a guy from Minnesota, right?
Agabodi, Minnesota. Actually, that ship was Jamkomst.
Yeah.
It was built in the 1970s.
Or in the 70s already.
By a farmer in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And he died, but the boat was completed, built in the old style.
Yeah.
And then sailed from Duluth and went to Bergen.
And back again.
In the 80s, and I was there when it came in.
Oh, really?
Nice.
Oh, cool. There you go. Okay, so he was there when it came into Bergen.
Then it went down Stavanger to Oslo.
Yeah.
And it's now back in Moorhead, Minnesota at the
Exactly.
Jamkom Center.
Yeah.
And we were there about 2 months ago.
Oh, amazing. Oh, cool! Yeah, because I've had several people from Minnesota who've been to this place in Moorhead, where you can see the boat today. So now it's all landlocked. But yeah, thank you for that. So homecoming. So that's been all over the world. Just some guy who really liked Viking ships. You see, you can do it if you put your mind to it. And then in the 80s, you had the Saga Sigla. That was Ragnar Thorstedt's boat that sailed all over the world, which, as I mentioned, was based on the Oseberg ship, which is from the 800s. Was found excavated in the 1880s. And it's actually really rare to find a Viking ship because most of them have decomposed. And now recently in the paper, some archaeologists were really excited because they had found a Viking ship, but you can only, it was like a muddy outline of it, but as soon as air came to it, it started to rot. So they were like trying to salvage whatever they could because it was just disappearing. So these might probably be the only proper Viking ships we'll ever find, actually. And you can see them at the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, which sadly is closed for renovation until like 26, right? Yeah. But they're gonna... Roskilde has some. Okay, the Danes. No. Don't listen to the Danes. Roskilde, that's right. They have a whole very cool one. Okay, so go to Roskilde, and then in 26 you can come back to Oslo. How about that? So this is just some pictures of what the new museum is going to look like. It's going to be a bit more like a general history museum of the Vikings. And this is the most modern one. This is sailing today, which is called Drakan Harald Hårfagre, this big Viking ship. And you can apply to be a crew member here. So I'm just saying, for your next holiday, perhaps, you can do this. So then, just finally, before I let you go, there was David. He made a documentary of this entire voyage. And that was shown, I think, briefly on the BBC in the 90s, and then it's been shown at a maritime museum in Norway, I don't know. But then the physical video, this was a pre-digital age, they'd been lost. So I'd never seen this film, and it was lost for many, many years. Until 2 years ago, when my mother, she received a letter in the mail from a guy who was in the production. And he said that he was moving, so he had to, organize his attic or something, and then he'd found copies of the original tapes, and then he'd put them on a USB, digitalize them, and there was a copy of that USB with the letter. So now we have that film, and I saw it for the first time last year, and would like to share it with you all. So we're going to be showing that at 9:30 this evening. So hope to see you there, and thank you very much for your attention. That was the Viking Voyages.